in the darkness between the stars, far from the golden light of holy terror and the watchful gaze of the Imperium, there drifts a thing that should not exist. It is called the Brokenback, a space hulk, an amalgamation of dozens of lost spacecraft fused together by the unknowable tides of the warp into a single, grotesque vessel. Its hull is a twisted mass of corroded metal and ancient stone, studded with rusted weapon turrets and trailing ribbons of wreckage like the tattered shroud of some vast, dead thing. Wings and sensor clusters jut from its surface at strange angles, and deep scars bleed shreds of debris into the void. Dozens of engines spray glowing exhaust in every direction, pushing this monstrous craft through the emptiness of space. And within that hideous vessel, in chambers and corridors salvaged from 100 different ships, live the Soul Drinkers, a chapter of space marines, unlike any other in the Imperium of Man. To understand how they came to dwell in such a place, one must go back many thousands of years, to the earliest days of the Imperium itself. The Soul Drinkers were founded from the gene seed of Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, one of the Emperor's own sons, a warrior of unshakable resolve and unyielding honor. For millennia, the Soul Drinkers served the Imperium faithfully, clad in their distinctive purple armor and bearing the golden chalice that was the symbol of their chapter. They fought the enemies of mankind across 1,000 worlds, carrying out the Emperor's will with bolter and blade. But the Imperium is not what it once was. 10,000 years have passed since the Emperor walked among his people, and in that vast span of time, the institutions he built have become bloated, corrupt, and tyrannical. The administratum grinds billions beneath its uncaring bureaucracy. The ecclesiarchy demands blind obedience. The Inquisition hunts those who dare question the established order. And somewhere within this vast, decaying machine, the Soul Drinkers found themselves betrayed. It began when a sacred relic was stolen from them, the Soul Spear, a weapon of ancient provenance and deep meaning to the chapter. In the conflict that followed, as the Soul Drinkers struggled to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, they were drawn into a web of manipulation and deception. Their chapter master, Gorgalian, clung to the old ways, beholden to the very institutions that had wronged them. And so a warrior named Sarpedon, a librarian, a psyker of extraordinary power, led a rebellion within the chapter itself. Gorgalian fell. The old order was overthrown, and Sarpedon, now chapter master, made a choice that would echo through the ages. He turned his back on the Imperium. Not on the Emperor, never on him. Sarpedon and his followers still believed in the Emperor's vision for humanity, still fought to protect the innocent and destroy the enemies of mankind. But they would no longer serve the corrupt institutions that claimed to act in his name. The Soul Drinkers became renegades, hunted by the very Imperium they had once served, declared traitors and heretics by those who could not comprehend that loyalty to the Emperor and loyalty to the Imperium were not the same thing. And in the midst of this upheaval, something else had changed. The forces that had manipulated the Soul Drinkers, powers from the warp itself, from the realm of chaos, had left their mark upon the chapter. Mutations began to manifest among the Battle Brothers, strange and terrible alterations to their flesh. Some grew additional limbs, others found their hands twisted into grotesque claws, and Sarpedon himself was transformed most dramatically of all. From the waist down, his human legs were replaced by 8 arachnid limbs, like those of some enormous spider, tipped in long, razor-sharp talons. He became a monster in the eyes of anyone who beheld him, and yet within that monstrous frame beat the hearts of a warrior who refused to surrender his principles. The Soul Drinkers fought to prove that the mutations were not the touch of chaos, but something else, perhaps even a gift from the Emperor himself, a mark of their newfound independence. They battled daemons and traitors, proving again and again that they served no dark master. They defeated the daemon Abraxas, who had tried to claim them for the ruinous powers. They fought the plagued daemon Vermeth on a world of poisoned oceans. They lost brothers along the way, good men, brave warriors, and among those losses was Sergeant Telos, once one of Sarpedon's closest comrades, who succumbed to the very corruption the chapter fought against. Through it all, the Soul Drinkers endured. They recruited new members from among the oppressed and rebellious peoples of the Imperium, turning them into space marines as the old chapter had done, but with less of the extensive mental conditioning that the Imperium typically employed. Sarpedon wanted their minds to be as free as the chapter itself, and slowly, painfully, the Soul Drinkers rebuilt. But freedom, as it turned out, carried its own dangers. Deep in the heart of the Brokenback, so far from the massive warp engines and the tramping of power-armored feet that it might have been deep underground on some forbidden planet, there lay a sanctum. Its original purpose was uncertain. Presumably it had been part of a spaceship at one time, for the hulk was an amalgamation of spacecraft welded together by the forces of the warp. But this place was stone, not metal, and its elegant, simple temple was partially submerged in a dark, half-flooded cave dripping with stalactites. Dim lights glowed beneath the water, glow globes that had been lit when the cave was first discovered and had probably burned patiently for hundreds or thousands of years, waiting for worshippers who would never return. Chaplain Ictinos walked along the submerged path, the lower edges of his purple and black power armor lit strangely by the light from below. He wore a grim skull-faced helmet, its eyepieces black and expressionless, and an eagle-topped mace. His Crozius Arcanum hung at his waist. Like any space marine, Ictinos was enormous, not much shy of 3 meters tall in his armor, but even so it was with something resembling humility that he passed into the temple itself. The sanctum within was also half underwater, the lights below the surface casting shifting patterns along the ceiling. Ictinos knelt beside a collection of monitoring equipment piled incongruously on a platform of fallen stone. He removed his helmet to reveal a smooth, unmarked face with large, expressive eyes, a face that seemed almost too gentle to belong beneath that sinister skull. Shaven-headed, and with light brown skin, Ictinos rarely took off his helmet, for it was a badge of office, a sign that he was a man apart. Here, in his secret sanctum, it was safe to do so. He checked a monitor screen, then reached down into the water with the awesome strength that every space marine possessed, and hauled a large rectangular slab of stone from beneath the surface. It was a coffin, carved with the image of a stern-faced king, and when Ictinos opened the clasps and removed the lid, the muffled screaming began. Inside was a wretched figure, thin, filthy, with a bag over its head trailing tubes and wires connected to the monitors. The skin on its hands was pallid and sagging, rotting from the damp, and the stench was awful. Ictinos pulled the bag free, revealing the swollen, white face of a man whose eyes were blind and milky. He pulled the tube from the man's throat, and the prisoner could finally scream properly, howling sobs of desperation and fear that echoed through the ancient cave. This was Astropath Minoris Croivaz Velscanian, and he had been Ictinos' prisoner for a very long time. Astropaths were the Imperium's only means of communication across the vast interstellar distances, psychic messengers who sent and received coded information through the warp itself. Croivaz had come to the Soul Drinkers willingly, fleeing the horrors of a world called Dushan, begging the Chaplain to take him away. Ictinos had accepted, and the rest of the chapter had never known. Now Croivaz begged for release, or for death, or for anything other than the nightmares that consumed him in the sealed darkness of his coffin, but Ictinos was unmoved. He demanded that Croivaz sift through the psychic messages that had filtered through his dreaming mind, the coded communications that flickered across the Imperium from astropath to astropath. And so Croivaz, broken and weeping, told what he had dreamed. The galaxy was at war, as it always was. Cadia was besieged, the Eye of Terror vomiting forth hordes of traitors and abominations. Unknown aliens had carved out an empire on the southern fringe. Skeletal mechanical creatures were awakening near the galactic core. Religious schisms, Xenos pirates, plagues of insanity, 100,000 wars burning across 1,000,000 worlds. But one message made Ictinos pause: greenskins, orcs, flooding through the jungles of a planet deep in the Segmentum Tempestus. A world called Vanqualis in the Obsidian system, invaded without warning by a massive orc horde. Its defenders shattered, its fleet destroyed, its people crying out for help that would never come. Ictinos pressed Croivaz for every detail, then forced the tubes back into the astropath's throat and pushed the coffin back beneath the water. The screaming faded to a muffled whimper, and then to silence. The chaplain pulled his skull-faced helmet back on and walked out of the sanctum. He had what he needed. The next stage of a plan far greater than anyone aboard the Brokenback could imagine was about to begin. In the auditorium that had once been a xenobiology lecture theatre on a long-lost explorator ship, the Soul Drinkers gathered. Large dusty jars containing the preserved bodies of strange alien creatures were mounted on the walls, and Chapter Master Sarpedon stood at the center on top of a large dissection slab, looking out over the hundreds of battle brothers assembled before him. He was a horrendous sight to any who did not know him. From the waist up, he was unmistakably a space marine. Massive, powerful, clad in purple power armor, worked into a high collar containing the protective Aegis circuit, the golden chalice symbol of the chapter embossed on every surface. His shaven head was scarred by decades of war, his eyes sunken with the weight of all he had witnessed. But from the waist down, he was something else entirely. 8 arachnid legs, tipped in long talons, jutted from his body where human legs should have been. One of his front legs was bionic, the original having been torn away in some past battle. Sarpedon addressed his chapter with the careful pride of a leader who had brought his people through impossible odds. They had rebuilt. New recruits had been found and trained. Captains made their reports. Chaplain, a grizzled veteran in one of the chapter's rare suits of Terminator armor, spoke of the novices who had earned their full armor fighting elder pirates. A young sergeant named Eumenes had distinguished himself and was recommended for full command. The sniper rake was the best shot in the chapter, perhaps as good as the legendary Captain Dreo. It was Chaplain Ictinos who steered the conversation toward Vanqualis. He spoke of the obsidian system with careful precision, explaining how the planet had been invaded by orcs, how its people had begged for help from the Imperium and received nothing. He spoke of their independent spirit, their resistance to the imperial yoke, and he noted, with pragmatic calculation, that the system contained a refinery world called Tyrankos, from which the soul drinkers could resupply their dwindling stores of fuel and ordnance. The debate that followed was fierce. Librarian Tyrendian argued that they should be fighting at the Eye of Terror, where the forces of chaos had made their move. Captain Luco countered that the entire Inquisition was there, and going anywhere near it was suicide for a renegade chapter. Tech Marine Ligris confirmed that without significant resupply soon, the Brokenback itself would begin to fail. Then a voice cut through the discussion like a blade. "Let them rot," said Eumenes. The young sergeant pushed his way to the front, sharp, intelligent eyes burning with conviction. He was brilliant, and he knew it. A soldier who had earned his armor through skill and courage, but whose mind harbored ideas far more radical than anything Sarpedon had anticipated. Eumenes argued that the people of Vanqualis were no better than the rest of the corrupt Imperium, that the soul drinkers should stop wasting their strength defending worlds that would only breed more tyranny, that the time had come to strike at the Imperium itself, at its bastions and holy worlds, at the very Astronomican if they dared, tear it all down and rebuild humanity from the ashes. Sarpedon was horrified. "This is madness, Eumenes. If the Imperium fell, the human race would follow." But Eumenes would not be silenced. "I have no master," he declared, his eyes alight with anger. "Not you. Not the Imperium. No one." The auditorium fell silent. Every soul drinker watched, waiting to see what would happen. Sarpedon had fought the chapter before. He had overthrown Gorgoleon, battled adherents to the old ways, even faced his own corrupted brother Telos. But never had the challenge come so brazenly, so openly, from within the ranks of the new chapter he had built. And the most troubling thing was this: the chapter did not unite behind Sarpedon to cast down the rebel. In the faces of the assembled soul drinkers, Sarpedon could read anger, yes, but also apprehension, and perhaps some admiration for Eumenes' boldness. An honor duel was the only way to settle it. The old way, as ancient as the Imperial Fist Legion itself, stretching back to the days of Rogel Dawn. First blood, Sarpedon declared. He would not grant Eumenes anything so noble as death. They fought in a vast domed chamber deep within the Brokenback, a cathedral of writhing statues and thigh-deep water, watched by the entire chapter. Eumenes was fast, faster than Sarpedon anticipated. He fought dirty and without hesitation, striking with a ruthlessness that went beyond the discipline of a space marine. For a terrible moment, when Eumenes held a shard of sharpened stone at Sarpedon's throat, it seemed the young rebel might win. But Sarpedon was stronger, and in the end, it was Eumenes whose face bled from the impact of a shattered statue. First blood. The duel was over. For a few seconds, Sarpedon saw nothing in Eumenes' eyes but the raw desire to kill. The honor of the duel was forgotten. Then, slowly, Eumenes' grip relaxed, and something like triumph settled on his features, as if he believed he had proven himself right merely by coming so close. "Take him to the brig," said Sarpedon quietly. "Post a guard." And then, to Tech Marine Ligris, take us to the Obsidian system, make the chapter ready for war. Far away, on the world of Vanqualis, war had already come. It had come without warning, during the trooping of the warding standard, the grandest military ceremony on all of Vanqualis, when thousands of troops in magnificent uniforms paraded through the processional quarter of Palatium, the capital city of the continent of Nevermorn. The soldiers were resplendent in white bearskins and jackets of midnight blue and silver brocade. Their officers were members of the Falcon family, the noble house that had ruled Vanqualis for centuries. Even the casings of their artillery shone in brass and blue. Lord Globus Falcon watched from the aristocratical pavilion, surrounded by counts and barons and ladies, all swathed in silks beneath a canopy that shielded them from the tropical sun. It was a day of pageantry, of tradition, of the magnificent display that kept the billions of citizens in Vanqualis' distant hive cities in awe of their rulers. The Falcons ruled by magnificence, not by the gun. Or so they believed. The first blast hit the processional quarter square on, throwing broken bodies and severed limbs into the air, 100 men destroyed in a single second. The warding standard itself, stitched together from a dozen regimental banners, fell tattered and bloody to the ground. The second blast hit the aristocratical pavilion. Lord Globus was vaporized. Lady Acania was beheaded by a shard of missile casing. Counts and barons were shredded. It was an orbital artillery strike. Guns high in orbit above Vanqualis threw explosive shells down at the city. And it came utterly without warning, because Battlefleet Scaphan, the naval force that should have protected the system, had already been destroyed. Up in orbit, Fleet Admiral Thalak died screaming as orcs tore his flagship apart around him, his arm ripped from his body by the mechanical claw of a greenskin warlord who held him aloft like a standard of conquest. On the surface, asteroids fell from the sky. Not natural ones, great slabs of rock, plated with metal on their undersides, studded with crude engines to direct their descent. They slammed into the heart of Palatium, and from the deep pits within them poured thousands of orcs. Massive, brutal, green-skinned creatures with murderous red eyes and mouths full of broken tusks, maddened with the joy of slaughter. They surged through the streets of the city, butchering soldiers and civilians alike with crude guns and rusted cleavers. Lord Sovelin Falcon, a young artillery officer, the most junior of the family's scions, was one of the few who managed to get his men out. He had sensed something wrong and pulled his artillery regiment from the parade early. When the bombs fell and the asteroids crashed down, he led his men through the Malkadorian Gate and into the vast jungles of Nevermorn, fleeing with thousands of terrified civilians as the orcs overran the city behind them. At the great temple of Imperator Ascendant, the orc warlord surveyed his conquest. He was enormous, twice the height of any man, with skin as dark and gnarled as ancient bark. Half his body was mechanical, a crude apparatus of rusted metal and hissing steam that encased his torso and replaced one arm with a massive three-fingered claw. But what set him apart from his fellow greenskins was not his size or his brutal augmentations. It was the intelligence that burned in his deep-set eyes. This was not a mindless brute. This was a creature of vision and terrible purpose. The warlord tore a tapestry from the temple wall, one that depicted the earliest warders of Vanqualis trampling the bodies of slain orcs beneath their feet. He held it up for his followers to see, bellowing in the guttural syllables of the orcish tongue. This planet had belonged to the orcs once, long ago. The humans had taken it from them, and now the orcs would take it back. Across the sea, in the towering hive cities of the continent of Herograve, Countess Ismanisa Falcon received the terrible news. She was over 200 years old, kept alive by the constant attentions of Juvenat technology, a frail figure in pearl-studded gowns connected by cables to a throne that pumped age-reversing chemicals through her veins. Her pinnacle chamber sat at the very top of one of Herograve's hives, and from its tall arched windows she could see the vast slope of the city spreading out below her, studded with lights against the night's darkness, sweeping down toward the polluted plains that surrounded it. In the far distance, another mountain of scattered lights smudged through the polluted air. A neighboring city, one of several that dotted the continent. Billions of Vanqualians lived within those cities, and in a few hours they would begin to learn that their ruling class was all but destroyed, and aliens had invaded Nevermorn. Behind her throne lurked her attendant children, Servitors crafted from the bodies of falcon offspring who had not survived childhood, blue-grey-skinned things that crawled on all fours like animals, their black eyes following every movement. The servitor technology leased to House Falcon by the Adeptus Mechanicus was complex and flawed, and the half-living children fell well short of the cherubic ideal. The Countess stroked the head of the nearest one as she might comfort a pet, unperturbed by its hollow gaze. With her husband dead and most of the family destroyed, the Countess was now the ruler of Vanqualis. She understood, with the pragmatism of centuries, that her world could not stand alone, and so she summoned her astropath and gave him two messages to send. The first was a general call for help, a desperate plea to the Imperium at large. The second was something far more specific. In a gene-locked void safe in the deepest archives of the city, there existed a document bound in steel, its crystal pages inscribed with flowing script. It spoke of honor and of oaths, binding two parties together across the centuries. One signature belonged to Herodane Falcon, a mighty lord from Vanqualis's past. The other belonged to a man named Orlando Furioso, and beside his name were the symbols of the eagle and the griffon. It was an honor debt, and Countess's Manisa was calling it in. The help that came first was not what anyone had hoped for. The 901 1st Penal Legion arrived on Vanqualis, not the Imperial Guard regiments or Navy battle fleets that the Countess had prayed for, but a collection of convicted criminals, murderers, and outcasts given one final chance to serve the Emperor by dying in his name. Their general was a man named Glyven Var, who had once commanded real soldiers in a real war, before some unspoken crime had stripped him of his rank and condemned him to lead the damned. Var was a pragmatist. He knew the 901 1st had been sent to Vanqualis not because they could save it, but because they were the only unit close enough to respond, and because their deaths would cost the Imperium nothing. He knew that among his troops were men like Lieutenant Kulek, a multiple murderer whose love of killing made him terrifying even to his fellow criminals, and Brother Trox, a haunted preacher whose religious fervor burned with the intensity of a man convinced that the Emperor's wrath would fall upon him at any moment. For 2 weeks, the 901 1st fought a desperate holding action in the jungles of Nevermorn, trying to slow the Orc advance. They were a strange army, these condemned men. There were those among them who had been soldiers once, real soldiers before whatever crime or failure of duty had brought them low. Lieutenant Fulgurin was one such man, an aristocrat by birth who still believed, despite everything, that the men of the 901 1st were human beings in the eyes of the Imperium. He led from the front, taking his place among his troops, with lasgun and bayonet, and if he had ever been the kind of officer who stood well back from the fighting, that man was long gone. Then there were the others. Lieutenant Kulek was a bear of a man with a shaven head and the flat, dead eyes of a predator. His crime was no secret. He was a multiple murderer, a collector of skulls, a man who loved killing with an enthusiasm that even the most hardened soldiers found unsettling. He led a mob of similar men, the butchers, who competed with each other in acts of savagery. In a civilized regiment, Kulek would have been executed. In the 901 1st, he was one of the forces that held the unit together. Brother Trox was something else entirely. He was deeply, feverishly religious, a preacher whose haunted hollow eyes blazed with the conviction that the Emperor's wrath was perpetually about to fall upon him. The nature of his crime was whispered about, but never confirmed. The rumors tended towards something involving women. Whatever he had done, it had left him fatalistic and grim, and his followers gradually became the same, men who did not care whether they survived the next battle as long as they died with the Emperor's name on their lips. And above them all stood General Var, a man who had once commanded real armies in real wars. He had fought through the Eye of Terror with the Karduniash Heavy Lancers, and held his last command as a Free Guard officer before whatever unspoken sin had brought him to the 901 1st. He was a reader of battles, a man who could see the ebb and flow of combat like a chess player reading a board. But the 901 1st were not chess pieces. They were broken men, condemned men, and Var's role was not so much to command them as to point them at the enemy and hope for the best. They established a defensive line at the Wraithspire Palace, a magnificent structure wrought from the living wood of Nevermorn's greatest trees, its staterooms hollowed from the trunk, its branches hung with chapels and landing pads like ornate baubles. Nearby, Lord Sovelin Falcon's surviving Vanqualian artillerymen held the flank, their deep blue uniforms and colourful sashes mud-spattered and torn, their brass and silver gun mountings dulled by weeks of fighting. The two forces, the aristocratic warders and the criminal penal legion, did not mix. They came from very different worlds, in every sense. It was there, at the Wraithspire Palace, that the orcs came in force. The bombardment came first, great dark shells screaming through the canopy, exploding among the soaring trunks and branches of the palace, filling the air with shards of burning wood. Var watched a man cut in two, the halves of his body flopping into an ornamental pond. Another stumbled by with one arm missing, clutching at the bleeding stump. The palace grounds, once a vision of manicured beauty, ornamental lakes and stands of flowers and elegant statuary, became just another killing ground. Then came the beast. A tremendous sound boomed from the jungle, a monstrous trumpeting accompanied by the crash of splintering trees. It burst out into the open air, crushing ancient greatwood trees before it. 15 meters tall, covered in shaggy matted hair, with enormous tusks and a maw so crammed with teeth it could not close. On a platform lashed to its back, scores of smaller greenskins goaded it forward with spears, and behind it charged thousands upon thousands of orcs, their guns blazing, their war cries drowning out the sound of the jungle. Kulek's butchers broke cover and charged straight at it. Var could hear the big man's voice roaring through the din. "Mellum, sir?" Like livin' gone bad, like all them murders stood up and come to life. "Gonna be a good one, lads." A missile streaked into the beast and blew a chunk of flesh from its shoulder, but the damage was superficial. It lowered its head and drove its jaw along the ground, churning up turf, then wrenched its head back up, flipping 2 or 3 troopers into its maw. The men simply vanished into that cavern of teeth. Var knew his men were going to die. The knowledge settled over him with a strange clarity, almost peaceful. This was his punishment. This was where it ended. And then the Thunderhawks came. The roar of engines streaked overhead. Twisting contrails rippled through the air. A split second later, chains of deafening explosions sent enormous columns of earth and broken greenskin bodies into the sky. Dark purple gunships swooped low, heavy bolters stitching lines of fire through the orc horde. Space Marines. From the open doors of the Thunderhawks, huge armored figures dropped into the heart of the battle, bolt pistols blazing and chainswords raised. Where they landed, the orcs recoiled. And then came something else. Something that turned the tide completely. Vast dark shapes loomed over the battlefield, 100 meters tall, wrought from shadow and burning with purple fire. They had the hunched forms and violent eyes of malevolent orcish gods, come down to punish the greenskins. The orcs let out a terrible wailing, a sound Var had never heard from the creatures before. They broke. They ran. It was Sarpedon's psychic power, the Hell, as it was known. He took the fury inside him, concentrated it until it was white-hot, and projected it outward as visions of terror. The orcs saw their own gods turned against them, and their resolve shattered. Captain Luco was the first soul-drinker that Var met properly. He came striding through the aftermath of the battle, bareheaded, his dark strip of hair running down the center of his scalp, his lightning claws still blackened with scorched orcish blood. Where Var had expected the grim severity of a warrior monk, he found instead a man with a wide face that broke easily into a triumphant grin, a man who spoke of battle as if it were a hearty joke. "Commander Sarpedon sent me," said Luco. "The gunships have taken a pass over the tree line. Looks like the orcs have retreated into the jungle and are regrouping." Var tried to explain what the 901st was. Criminals, sinners, men condemned to die. Luco would have none of it. "You were sent here to save this planet," he said. "If you think these men can serve their emperor by dying, think how much better they can serve him by surviving." And so an unlikely alliance was formed. The renegade Space Marines and the condemned Penal Legion, fighting side by side in the green darkness of Nevermourne's jungles. Across the void, aboard a ship called the Cerulean Claw, a very different force was bearing down on the Obsidian system. The Cerulean Claw was a temple to honor and to fallen comrades. Its pale marble walls and floors were inscribed with thousands of names, the dates and places of death of the Howling Griffons chapters honored dead. Braziers lit every corridor and shrine so that no fallen battle brother's name ever fell into shadow. In every great gallery, A huge ever-burning fire hung in the air like a caged sun. The Howling Griffons were sons of Robout Guilliman, successors of the Ultramarines, and they were defined by one quality above all others: they kept their promises. Every oath sworn by a Howling Griffon was a sacred thing, inscribed into his armor, carried as a weight upon his soul until it was fulfilled. Some of those oaths were thousands of years old. The chapter carried them all. Chief Librarian Meccano was the most formidable of them. His long, leathery face was dark with years, his eyes black as flint, and his massive power armor was inscribed with endless lines of obligations and honor debts. He had recently led the chapter to fulfill their greatest oath, the vengeance for Chapter Master Orlando Furioso, who had been murdered more than 3,000 years ago by a traitor named Pericletor. Meccano had hunted the daemon that Pericletor had become across the Eye of Terror, from Daemon World to Dead Space, and had killed it with his own force axe. The wound of Furioso's death, raw as the day it was dealt even after 3 millennia, had finally been allowed to heal. But another oath remained. Orlando Furioso himself had given his word to the people of Vanqualis, pledging the Howling Griffons to their defense. That debt had been called in, and Meccano would honor it with the full weight of 300 Space Marines. Traveling with the Howling Griffons, reluctantly tolerated rather than welcomed, was an inquisitor named Thaddeus. He had the face of a scholar, hollow-eyed and thinning-haired, and wore a long, dark, flack-weave coat over black clothing. He did not wear the stylized eye that proclaimed his authority, but the fact that he spoke to Meccano as an equal was proof enough of his rank. Thaddeus had his own reasons for coming to the Obsidian system, reasons he was not yet willing to share. He had spent years tracking the soul drinkers across the galaxy, following not Imperial records, which had been ordered deleted, but the traces they left in the mythologies of primitive peoples. On world after world, he had found legends of dark-armored warriors bearing a chalice, who drank the souls of men, the Grail of the Damned, the Obsidian Skull, the Drinker of Souls, and on Vanqualis itself, the most chilling legend of all, the Black Chalice, a fountain from which all evil flowed, born by giant armored warriors who would one day return from the sky to claim the world as their own. Someone connected to the Soul Drinkers had visited the Obsidian system a very long time ago, and left behind a scar so deep it had become a religion. Thaddeus needed to understand why, and he suspected that the answer would be more dangerous than anything the Orcs could bring to Vanqualis. On the surface of Nevermorn, the war ground on, Sarpedon had devised a plan to break the Orc advance. The Greenskins were massing in the Serpent Spine Valley, a long depression cutting through the jungle toward the heights, the only defensible high ground for miles around, which the Orcs needed as a staging area for their push to the coast. If the Soul Drinkers and the 901 First could pin the horde in the valley, the Brokenback's orbital guns could carpet them with fire and destroy them in a single stroke. It was the kind of plan that only Space Marines would dare attempt. In the Adeptus Astartes, Sarpedon told Var, they were accustomed to only needing one shot. The plan was bold, even reckless. General Var knew it would cost lives. "We'll lose a lot of men," he said. "You'll lose them anyway," replied Sarpedon. "This jungle will take them." The Soul Drinkers advanced through the darkness, the green-black mass of Nevermorn's jungle pressing in on all sides. Captain Luco led the forward elements, the power fields of his lightning claws crackling with blue-white energy. Sergeant Gravis was beside him, his power axe weighted in his grotesquely deformed hand, one of the more obvious mutations that mark the chapter's altered nature. Gravis wielded the massive weapon one-handed, as lightly as a fencer's sword. "Don't get lost down there, Luco," said Gravis as the Orc horde surged up from the valley below. "Just draw them up here, in and out. You don't have to kill them all yourself." Luco grinned that savage grin of his. "Don't tempt me, Gravis. I might wipe these Xenos out just to teach you a lesson." Then there was no more time for talk. A lurching machine of metal 3 times the height of a man tore through the trees, one arm spitting gunfire while the other wielded a screeching circular saw that sliced through tree trunks as if they were made of paper. Behind it came thousands of Orcs, a dark tide of green flesh and rusted blades, pouring up the valley slope in a wave of howling, bellowing violence. The difference between a Space Marine and a normal man was far more profound than just a suit of armor and physical size. The true difference, the one that made a man into a Space Marine, was that fear never ruled him. Fear clouded the judgment of normal men, made them run or hide or lash out blindly. A Space Marine knew his fear, acknowledged it, and strangled it. He knew that he was safest not running from the enemy but toe to toe with it, face to face, where his strength and war gear counted for the most. Luco ducked under the war machine's gun barrel and raked down at its leg, mounting with his power claw, the blades rupturing metal as they went. Gravis's assault squad tore through the branches above on flaring jump packs, their chainswords spraying orc blood as they churned. Lord Sovelin Falcon's artillery pounded the valley from the heights, while the 901 first held the head of the valley in a desperate defensive line, Brother Trox's voice raised above the din in wild, rapturous prayer. And then Sarpedon came face to face with the orc warlord himself. They met on the hillside, crashing through dense trees, two titanic figures drawn together by something that went beyond tactics or strategy, something primal, a recognition between leaders that only one of them could walk away. The warlord's mechanical claw snapped at Sarpedon's body while its natural hand tried to dig claws into his throat. Steam sprayed from the joints of the orc's mechanical torso, the fires within raging hotter to match Sarpedon's psychic fury. Step by step, blow by blow, Sarpedon forced the warlord back. He could feel the beast's heart thudding in its chest, smell the blood hissing against the red-hot plates of its body. And in the creature's eyes he saw something disturbingly human, a reflection of his own hatred, a drive and intelligence that elevated this orc above the mindless savagery of its kind. The thought that there was something human about the creature's hatred filled Sarpedon with a sudden flood of rage and disgust. With a final surge of raw anger, Sarpedon barged the orc off the cliff's edge. The creature bellowed as it fell, its mechanical claw closing on thin air, and everywhere a terrible orcish cry of loss went up as the greenskins witnessed their leader bested. For a moment, just a moment, pride swelled in Sarpedon's hearts. The defense of Vanqualis seemed possible. The orcs looked weak for the first time, and then a lance of fire bore down from the sky and vaporized the Vanqualian artillery. The betrayal came from within. While Sarpedon fought on the surface, Eumenes had escaped the brig aboard the Brokenback. With the support of scouts and battle brothers he had secretly recruited to his cause, including, most shockingly, Apothecary Pallas, one of Sarpedon's oldest and most trusted friends. Eumenes had seized control of the ship. He took the bridge, killed those who resisted, and turned the Brokenback's guns on the Soul Drinkers' allies below. The orbital bombardment that destroyed Lord Sovelin's artillery was just the beginning. More fire rained down on the hills, and then Eumenes' loyalists on the surface opened fire on Sarpedon's forces from behind. Captain Carradine, the grizzled, relentless veteran in his massive Terminator armor, was caught in the crossfire. He fought with a fury that defied comprehension, absorbing volley after volley of bolter fire, his armor cratering and cracking under the sustained assault. A plasma blast ate through his abdominal plate and cooked the flesh beneath, but still he fought on, firing his storm bolter even as burning loops of entrails began to hang from the wound in his stomach. Sarpedon could only watch as Carradine literally fell apart. Fire tore through his shoulder and his arm came free. His bionic leg shattered and buckled. His storm bolter's remaining ammunition detonated and took his other arm. He was still bellowing defiance as he toppled backwards, and Sarpedon could hear the point-blank bolter shots that finally silenced the old captain forever. "It's treachery, Sarpedon," Carradine had said with blood on his lips. "They've got the ship. We're next." Meanwhile, on the Brokenback, Tech Marine Ligris, the only person who truly understood the Hulk's labyrinthine interior, had escaped Eumenes' men. He fled into the network of tunnels and conduits that threaded through the ancient vessel, sabotaging the warp engines as he went, buying time for Sarpedon to mount a response. And far away, in the hidden temple orbiting Tyrankos, Chaplain Ictinos made a discovery that would change everything. The temple was extraordinary. The entire asteroid had been hollowed out and filled with a complex mass of floating columns and arches, as if 100 shrines had been shattered and reconstructed in weightless suspension. At its heart floated a building of gold and obsidian, guarded by ancient gun servitors that Ictinos somehow knew how to deactivate. The chalice symbol of the Soul Drinkers was everywhere, alongside the Imperial Aquila, emblems of the old chapter from before Sarpedon's rebellion. Inside the floating tomb was a library, thousands upon thousands of books, stacked on miles of shelves made of gold and black glass, soaring pillars encrusted with scrolls, huge smouldering censers bathing everything in amber glow, and at the far end, a golden chalice 5 meters tall, flanked by images of 2 space marines rendered in gilt against obsidian walls. Someone from the old soul drinkers had built this place. Someone had hidden a vast repository of knowledge here, guarded it with ancient defenses, and waited for someone worthy to find it. Scout Sergeant Rake had accompanied Ictinos to the temple. He was the best shot in the chapter, a natural-born killer recruited from a desert world where he had once picked off Imperial guardsmen from kilometers away. He was also secretly loyal to Eumenes, and had received orders to kill the Chaplain. He never got the chance. Ictinos had known about Rake's betrayal, just as he had known how to deactivate the temple's defenses. The Chaplain moved with impossible speed, getting behind Rake in a way that no one had ever managed before. And when Rake tried to turn and fire, the Crozius Arcanum fell in a deep, pure crescent and took his head clean off. Ictinos looked down at the body without emotion. Then he picked up a book from the nearest shelf. The chalice embossed on its cover told him everything he needed to know. He opened it and began to read, and the truth, the terrible, magnificent truth, flowed through him. On the surface of Nevermorn, the situation had deteriorated into something approaching despair. With the Brokenback in Eumenes' hands and the orbital guns turned against them, Sarpedon's loyalists had been scattered into the jungle. The Orc warlord had survived his fall from the cliffs and was rallying the horde for another push toward the coast. And now a new complication had arrived. Lord Sovelin Falcon, scorched and bleeding from the orbital strike that had destroyed his artillery, had seen Sarpedon's mutations during the battle. The spider legs, the chalice emblem, and in his mind a terrible connection had been made. The Black Chalice. Every child on Vanqualis knew the stories. The Black Chalice was a fountain from which all evil flowed. Its bearers were giant armored warriors who wore the chalice as their symbol, and who would one day descend from the sky to claim Vanqualis as their own. It was the darkest legend of the Vanqualian people, and now, staring at the mutant space marine in purple armor bearing the golden chalice on his shoulder, Sovelin was convinced that the legend had come true. Desperately, Sovelin raised Countess Menissa's household on the field vox. He was almost finished relaying his warning when a column of red-white fire lanced down from the sky and incinerated his men around him. Eumenes' orbital strike. Sovelin survived only because he had sheltered behind a tree. But the Vanqualian warders, the last of the proud military tradition of House Falcon on Nevermorn, were gone. The word spread to Heragrave the bearers of the Black Chalice had returned. Sarpedon, meanwhile, had retreated to a hidden cave in the depths of the jungle, its walls covered in primitive carvings of warfare and piled skulls. From this dismal command post he managed to re-establish contact with Ligris, still alive and hiding in the deepest recesses of the Brokenback. "I thought you were dead, brother," said Sarpedon, and there was a warmth in his voice that had not been there since the catastrophe began. Ligris reported that Eumenes was preparing to evacuate his surface forces and flee the system. The warp engines could be online within 2 days. Once Eumenes had his people aboard, he would jump into the warp and the loyal soul drinkers would be marooned on Vanqualis forever, to die among the criminals and the orcs. But this gave Sarpedon an advantage. He knew what Eumenes needed. The Thunderhawks that could have plucked the rebels off the fortress rooftop had been destroyed by Ligris' sabotage. All that remained were the old Onager orbital shuttles, fragile, unarmored craft that required a landing strip. And there was only one place on Nevermorn flat enough and clear enough for them to land the scorched hilltop, where an orcish asteroid had come down at a shallow angle, stripping the trees and foliage clean. Sarpedon positioned his forces in the tree line around the blasted hill and waited. The traitors would have to cross open ground to reach their shuttles. This time, the loyal soul drinkers would be the ones with the ambush. But Sarpedon had reckoned without the Howling Griffons. Aboard the Cerulean Claw, Chief Librarian Mercano had laid his plans with cold precision. The Howling Griffons would not fight in the jungles. Jungle warfare was the greenskins' ground, close quarters, chaotic, the kind of battle that favored numbers and brute strength over discipline and firepower. Instead, Mercano would give the orcs Nevermorn entirely. Let them surge to the coast, let them build their ramshackle fleet of lashed timber boats, let them launch their invasion of Heragrave across the sea. And when they were at their most vulnerable, crammed onto the beaches, exposed and disorganized, The Howling Griffons would be waiting to slaughter them in the surf. It was a sound plan, born of the tactical doctrine laid down by Rabaute Guilliman in the Codex Astartes, but it meant abandoning the tens of thousands of refugees still stumbling through the jungles of Nevermorn. Inquisitor Thaddeus challenged Mercano on this point, and was rebuffed with contempt. The Howling Griffons cared nothing for the opinion of an Inquisitor who had lied about his reasons for being there. Thaddeus knew he was running out of time. Whatever the Black Chalice truly was, whatever ancient enemy of the Soul Drinkers lurked in the Obsidian system, he needed to reach the surface before the Howling Griffons' plan made that impossible. And so the Inquisitor did what Inquisitors do when all other options fail. He ran. He had scouted the layout of the Cerulean Claw early in the voyage, because a good Inquisitor always plans for the moment when everything goes wrong. He knew where the secondary shuttle bay was, and he knew that the complex circuitry in his inquisitorial seal would likely open the door. What he had not planned for was Brother Relnon. The confrontation took place in the Remembrance Decks, a quiet, imposing forest of stone memorials, statues of fallen Howling Griffons standing guard over one another in marble and polished granite. It was a sacred place, a place of mourning and reflection, and Thaddeus felt the weight of that violation keenly as he drew his weapons in the midst of the honored dead. Relnon was everything a space marine should be: fast, powerful, disciplined, and utterly certain of his cause. Inquisitor Lord Mercano has ordered you confined to your quarters. "Does he now?" said Thaddeus, keeping a stone plinth between himself and the Howling Griffon. "And what's his excuse?" "He does not trust you." "The Lord Librarian is honest, at least." What followed was a desperate running fight through the memorial halls, bolt of fire shattering obsidian statues, stone heads smashing on the floor, centuries of carved memory blasted to rubble. Thaddeus used every weapon he had. His modified auto pistol, chased in brass and silver, fired mundane rounds that sparked uselessly off Relnon's power armor. His last Archaeotech round, a precious, irreplaceable bullet crammed with ancient targeting circuitry, bored into Relnon's arm and ricocheted inside his armor, shredding flesh and muscle. His xenoblade split into a swarm of monomolecular shards that scored deep lines across the Space Marine's face and punched through his back. And still Relnon fought on. "Traitor," he roared, spraying bolt of fire in a burning fan. "We should have thrown you out of the damned airlock." In the end, it was a grenade and a stone statue that decided the matter. Thaddeus detonated the charge against the statue above him just as Relnon charged, and the explosion tore the memorial apart. The stone-forced sword carved from the Librarian statue's hand impaled Relnon through the chest, cutting through his lungs and ending the fight. Relnon died among the honored dead of his chapter, and Thaddeus, bloodied, exhausted, and carrying one more death on his conscience, fled to the shuttle bay. "For the Emperor, Brother Relnon," he said as he left. There had been a time, as a young interrogator filled with righteous fervor, when Thaddeus would never have accepted the death of a good imperial servant as a necessary evil. But he was much wiser now, and much more tired. He stole a shuttle and raced for the surface. The Howling Griffons landed on Nevermorn, not to fight orcs, but to hunt renegades. The impact of a drop pod hitting home was heavy enough to shatter a normal man's bones. Chief Librarian Mercano did not skip a syllable as he spoke the last words of the rites of detestation, the sacred prayer of hatred that every Howling Griffon performed before battle. "It is only with victory that the Emperor can be praised," he intoned as the explosive bolts in the hull detonated and burst the pod open. "It is only with hatred that the victory can be won." "Only with hatred," echoed his command squad in unison, and then they were out of their restraints, and in the jungle, force axes and bolters ready, the stifling humidity of Nevermorn hitting them like a wall. Drop pods slammed into the jungle all around them, kicking up showers of mud. More Howling Griffons emerged. Captain Darion marshalling his 9th Company assault squads, Captain Borganor directing his hardened 10th Company into covering positions. Landers crushed through the canopy, bearing Rhino APCs and Predator battle tanks fitted with dozer blades to barge through the densest undergrowth. The vehicular column formed up with the speed and precision that only the Adeptus Astartes could achieve. Hundreds of Space Marines deployed and mounted in minutes, ready for war. Mercano's command Land Raider Crusader rolled forward at the head of the column, its automated bolt guns tracking left and right. Somewhere in this green hell were the bearers of the Black Chalice, the ancient enemy his chapter had sworn to destroy. For Mercano, this was not merely a military operation. It was a sacred duty, the fulfillment of an oath that bound every Howling Griffon to the soil of Vanqualis and the memory of Orlando Furioso. The Howling Griffons advanced through the jungle with all the unstoppable momentum of a tidal wave, and the Soul Drinkers were about to discover just how ruthlessly the Griffons kept their promises. Their target was the concentration of renegade space marines that their sensors had detected near the blasted hilltop, Sarpedon's loyalists, positioned and waiting for Eumenes' traitors to arrive. The Howling Griffons saw only the purple armor and the Chalice emblem, the Black Chalice, the ancient enemy they had sworn to destroy. The attack came just as Thaddeus's stolen shuttle crashed through the canopy and ploughed into the burned forest. Sarpedon's Soul Drinkers were suddenly caught between two threats: Eumenes' rebels approaching from one direction and Mercano's Howling Griffons from another. Thaddeus stumbled from the wreckage, limping and bleeding, and found himself face to face with Sarpedon for the first time since their encounter on Stratix Luminae. The two men had history. They had once united against a common enemy, but before that, Thaddeus had been dedicated to hunting down and destroying the Soul Drinkers. "I'm afraid I don't have much time for pleasantries," said Thaddeus. "Although I should say I am grateful to you for not killing me." "Don't thank me yet," replied Sarpedon. In the precious minutes before battle erupted, Thaddeus told Sarpedon what he had found. The legends scattered across the galaxy, the Black Chalice of Vanqualis, the unmistakable connection to the old Soul Drinkers chapter. "Someone brought us here," said Sarpedon, the terrible realization dawning. "We have been manipulated." "You have an enemy here," said Thaddeus. "And the only thing more dangerous than a renegade chapter is an enemy who can manipulate them to his will." "No one owns this chapter," said Sarpedon, and the fury in his voice was cold and absolute. "We are no one's weapon." Then the tanks of the Howling Griffons burst through the tree line, and there was no more time for words. The battle between the Soul Drinkers and the Howling Griffons was savage and tragic in equal measure, two chapters of the Emperor's finest tearing into each other with all the weapons at their disposal, each convinced of the righteousness of their cause. The Howling Griffons had numbers, armor, and the backing of the Codex Astartes. The Soul Drinkers had desperation, knowledge of the terrain, and the raw psychic power of their chapter master. Sarpedon unleashed the hell with everything he had, projecting nightmares across the battlefield. But the Howling Griffons were made of sterner stuff than orcs. They had fought daemons in the eye of terror. They had faced horrors that would break lesser men. The psychic onslaught staggered them but did not break them, and they came on with bolters blazing and chainswords screaming. The Soul Drinkers fought a running retreat through the jungles, taking losses with every step. And while they fought and bled and died, Eumenes' traitors slipped away unnoticed. The old Onager shuttles descended to the blasted hilltop, the rebels boarded in perfect silence, and the craft lifted off into the sky, carrying them back to the Brokenback and away from the carnage below. In the aftermath, Sarpedon was forced to make the hardest decision of his life. The Soul Drinkers were trapped. The Howling Griffons pursued them relentlessly, driving them into a vast, reeking swamp choked with dead vegetation and lurking predators. Ahead of them, the 901 1st Penal Legion, now under the command of the Howling Griffons, had been positioned to block their escape. Behind them, 300 of the finest space marines in the Imperium were closing in for the kill. There was only one way out, and it led through a door that Sarpedon could barely bring himself to open. He contacted Eumenes. The face that appeared on the view screen was young and triumphant, sharp, intelligent eyes blazing with a confidence that bordered on contempt. Eumenes had won. He knew it, and he wanted Sarpedon to know it too. The conversation was brief and bitter. Eumenes had the Brokenback. He had the warp engines nearly online. In less than an hour, he would be gone, and Sarpedon and his loyalists would be left to die in a swamp on a world that no one in the galaxy cared about. What could Sarpedon possibly offer? Survival, said Sarpedon, our future. I don't think I am the one whose survival is at stake, Sarpedon. Damn you, Eumenes, don't you even understand what is happening here? The Howling Griffons won't stop until the Soul Drinkers are destroyed. That means your men as well as mine. They outnumber you. They will hunt you across the galaxy. Even if you escape this system, They will find you, and they will destroy you. Let them try. Sarpedon forced down the anger inside him. Every word that followed cost him something he would never get back. I cannot pretend I do not despise you. You have betrayed me and everything I have fought for. But I cannot allow the Soul Drinkers chapter to die. All the Soul Drinkers are my battle brothers, and I will not hand the Howling Griffons a victory they won, only because we were divided. These are the words of a dying man, Sarpedon. Again, what can you offer me? The chapter, said Sarpedon. Silence. Yours to command, Sarpedon continued, and each word was like swallowing broken glass. I will relinquish my rank as chapter master. You will have everything, the secrets of the Brokenback, the battle brothers who sided with me, everything. I will obey you. The deal was struck. Eumenes would send down the alien ship that Ligris had found in the depths of the Brokenback, a vessel of unknown origin, unarmed but capable of carrying 200 space marines. In exchange, Sarpedon surrendered his command. But first, the Soul Drinkers had to fight their way through the 901 first. The battle in the swamp was a grim, heartless affair. The penal troopers fought bravely. They had been condemned men when they arrived on Vanqualis, but weeks of battle alongside the Soul Drinkers had given many of them something they had never expected to find purpose, and perhaps even a measure of redemption. Now they were fighting against the very Space Marines who had inspired them, and they did so with the fatalistic courage of men who had already accepted their deaths. General Var stood in the path of the Soul Drinkers' advance. He drew the ornate saber he had taken from a dead Vanqualian artilleryman and dropped into the fighting stance his father had taught him, the fluid, rapid Locrasian style that had been handed down through generations of soldiers. Var's father had served in the Locrasian 31st Light Infantry, a regiment that took their blades as seriously as their guns. He had taught his son to fight with bruises and broken skin, preparing him for a galaxy that showed no mercy to the unprepared. One day his father had left with his regiment to put down a rebellion, and he had never returned. All that remained of him was a catalogue of parries and thrusts, cuts and finishing blows. They were all useless. Against a Space Marine chapter master on 8 arachnid legs, even the finest swordsman in the galaxy would have lasted only moments. Var knew this. He fought anyway. He fended off the force staff with everything he had, his blade battered and chipped, growing more blunt with every exchange. His father would have whirled around, brought the blade up in a glittering arc with such poise and confidence that it would have sheared through the guard of his opponent. Var tried. The blade shattered on Sarpedon's armored forearm, and his wrist broke with it, white numb pain flooding through his arm. Sarpedon drove the force staff through the general's chest with what might have been a hint of real regret on his face. Var's body slid off the end of the staff and into the water, the foul swamp filth filling the hole in his chest. He sank slowly, his face serene, as if the punishment he had always expected had finally been delivered. General Var is dead, Sarpedon told Captain Luco quietly, watching the body disappear beneath the dark water. Then the Penal Legion troops will be leaderless. Give the order and we'll break through them. There is nothing to gain by that. They were put here to slow us down, and they have. By the time we break through, the Howling Griffons will be among us. The alien craft descended through the canopy. The Soul Drinkers boarded in grim silence, 200 warriors packed into the vessel's dark interior. Sarpedon was the last one on. He could feel the eyes of his battle brothers upon him, the accusation, the bewilderment, the sorrow. He had given away their chapter to save their lives, and not one of them spoke against him. But the weight of their silence was heavier than any condemnation. Captain Luco had come close to refusing. "There is no chapter any more, Sarpedon," he said, with a raw honesty that cut deeper than any blade. "The chapter died when you killed Gorgalian. All we have left are the principles for which we fight, and when those die, we might as well be another band of renegades killing for no reason." "Then walk away, Captain," Sarpedon had replied. "Lead these men back into the swamp and die the death you choose." Luco had stared at him for a long, terrible moment. Then he boarded the ship. "I do this because perhaps it will give me a chance to avenge Chaplain," he said. "And because you are still my chapter master." The ship rose into the sky. Below them, Vanqualis burned. The reunion aboard the Brokenback was as cold as the void between stars. Eumenes stood on the arena flight deck, surrounded by more than 200 Soul Drinkers pledged to his cause. His armor was ornate now, plated in gold, and he carried Lord Meccano's force axe as a trophy. The triumph in his eyes was unmistakable. Sarpedon and his loyalists disembarked in silence. For a moment, the two halves of the chapter faced each other across the deck, and the air between them was thick with barely contained violence. "Your men will garrison the eastern sections," said Eumenes. "Neither you nor your men shall be permitted anywhere near the bridge. My men will shoot on sight." "Understood," said Sarpedon. It was Chaplain Ictinos who stepped forward and saluted Eumenes, a simple gesture that diffused the tension just enough to prevent an immediate massacre. Eumenes saluted back. The moment passed. Then the Howling Griffons came for them all. Lord Meccano's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He loaded the entire surviving 901 1st Penal Legion into assault boats and hurled them at the far side of the Brokenback, a sacrifice of expendable lives to draw the soul drinkers' attention, while the real assault struck from below. The cerulean claw dropped out of Vanqualis' atmosphere directly beneath the hulk, trailing coils of vapor as it slid into the vacuum, with the slow majesty of a predator rising from the deep. It emerged directly below the Brokenback, twisting gracefully to bring its upper hull toward the hulk's underside, and from its launching bays streaked dozens of assault torpedoes and gunships, boring into the Brokenback's hull like parasites. From outside, the Brokenback was utterly hideous. Dozens of ships welded together into a single immense craft, grotesquely organic in places like bulging organs of metal, desolate and skeletal in others. Deep scars bled shreds of wreckage, and the hulk's many engines sprayed glowing exhaust in every direction. Against this monstrosity sped the shoal of Imperial attack craft, huge drills grinding beneath the eagles on their prows. Turrets opened fire, and the first assault boat to be destroyed exploded in a blossom of white nuclear flame, snuffed out a moment later in the vacuum. But the rest streaked on through the fire, like bright seeds of destruction. The 901st assault struck first. 2,000 penal troopers crashed into the gun decks of the Macharia Victrix, one of the Brokenback's ancient component warships. They came roaring out of the breached hull into the cavernous, dust-choked darkness of the gun deck, where enormous orbital lasers loomed several stories high like monuments from a forgotten age. And they charged with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. Killers and criminals fighting their final battle, driven forward by the howling exhortations of Brother Trox, who bellowed the praises of the Emperor with all the fervor of a man who believed every word might be his last. "For the Emperor," Trox screamed, his grenade launcher punching glittering bursts of shrapnel through the soul drinkers who met them. "For him do we seek redemption in the blood of his foes. This is the hour. This is the reckoning." Eumenes met them with cold efficiency. His soul drinkers fought the 901st back along the gun deck in brutal close-quarters combat, bolt rounds tearing through bodies at point-blank range, combat knives against chainswords. The screaming of men mingled with the deeper bass roar of space marine weapons. Scamander, one of the young psychers who had sided with Eumenes, drew heat from the air around him until frost spiraled across the ancient metal of the orbital guns, then poured it forth as a wall of fire that sent men tumbling to the ceiling, ablaze from head to foot. Then Eumenes sealed the blast doors and vented the atmosphere. Emergency systems opened the purging valves along the outer hull, and air boomed from the sealed section with the sound of a dying god. The decompression killed hundreds in moments. Men lifted off their feet and battered against the massive orbital lasers, blood running from their eyes, lungs rupturing in their chests. Some tried to run for the assault boats at the far end of the deck, but most simply died where they stood, gasping and convulsing as the void claimed them. Brother Trox was crushed between the closing blast doors, and with his last breaths he tried to spit out one final prayer. But only blood came, spattering down his chin as the doors ground together and the life was squeezed from his body. He died as he had lived, in the midst of the Emperor's words, reaching for a redemption that always seemed just beyond his grasp. The feint was over. But it had served its purpose. While Eumenes dealt with the 901 first, the Howling Griffons boarded the Brokenback in force. Meccano led the assault personally, driving deep into the Herald of Desolation, that ancient, nightmarish section of the hulk that served as the chapter's spiritual heart. The Herald was a place drenched in psychic energy, its dark cathedrals and hidden chambers charged with the residue of centuries of suffering. It was here that Sarpedon chose to make his stand. The battle raged through torture chambers and charnel houses, through lunatic asylums and sacrificial altars. The soul drinkers fought with the ferocity of the cornered, knowing that if the Howling Griffons took the warp engines, the Brokenback would be destroyed and everyone aboard it would die. And at the heart of it all, two librarians met in a clash of psychic power that transcended the physical battlefield entirely. Meccano found Sarpedon in the deepest bowels of the Herald of Desolation, in a chamber that had once served as a torture room. Rusted devices of metal frames and blades were arranged down the middle like an assembly line, the iron floor grated to drain away blood. Gouge marks on the walls showed where fingers worn to the bone had clawed for escape. The psychic residue of centuries of suffering clung to the place like smoke, and Sarpedon's power had stirred it. Ghostly forms writhed amid the torture devices, spectral hands reaching from between iron bars, blades slick with dark phantom blood. Meccano burst through the wall like a battering ram, his force axe already swinging. Sarpedon barely had time to raise his staff before the chief librarian's blow drove him through the wall behind and into the chamber beyond. Stone crumbled, dust filled the air, and then the physical world began to dissolve around them both. The throne temple of the daemon Pericletor materialized around Sarpedon like a waking nightmare. Soaring columns of skulls reached toward a ceiling like a sky of bleeding rust. Blood-filled channels cut into black marble spelled out runes that refused to be read. Through pits in the floor writhed thousands of daemons, their gibbering and screaming saturating the air with madness. And on a throne carved from an enormous skull sat Pericletor himself. Titanic, winged, his dark grey flesh oozing raw power, dozens of stolen eyes rolling in his hideous head. This was Meccano's doing. The chief librarian of the Howling Griffons had a level of control over his psychic powers that Sarpedon could not approach. Where Sarpedon was raw power and no finesse, the hell, those vast projections of fear that terrified orcs and men alike. Meccano was an architect of the mind, capable of building entire worlds of illusion. He had come to this very place in the Eye of Terror, had fought the real Pericletor on this very mountain peak, and had killed the daemon with his own force axe. Now he recreated it in Sarpedon's mind, hoping that the renegade would kneel before this image of daemonic power and reveal his true allegiance to the dark gods. But Sarpedon did not kneel. He had faced daemons before, real ones, not illusions, and he had beaten them. "You are no more Pericletor than I am the Black Chalice," he roared, and the fury of his defiance cracked the illusion at its foundations. Meccano was forced to drop the pretense. His image ghosted over Pericletor's massive form, much smaller but somehow more imposing. "You are a crude and brutal weapon, Sarpedon, all power and no finesse. The horrors you project are like the drawings of a child. I forge worlds." "Then I will show you mine," said Sarpedon, and he seized control of the psychic battlefield. The daemon world melted away. In its place rose the polluted shores of the world where Sarpedon had fought the plague daemon, Vermeth. Heavy waves thick with filth, the great fortress of pestilence looming above, the beach where Sarpedon had lost one of his legs to a chaos champion. Meccano stumbled, his world wrenched away from him, and Sarpedon pressed the attack. They fought through memory after memory, the beach of Vermeth's world, the Temple of Dawn on the Soul Drinker's old flagship where Sarpedon had killed Gorgolian. Each psychic landscape was a weapon, a testament to the battles each librarian had survived, and with every shift the physical duel of staff and axe grew more desperate. Meccano was a phenomenal warrior. His force axe carved arcs of glowing energy through the air, and his psychic defenses were nearly impenetrable. But Sarpedon fought with something Meccano did not possess, the knowledge that everything he had been told about his enemy was wrong. "There is no Black Chalice," Sarpedon told him, even as their weapons clashed. "It was a creation of someone from our chapter, from the Soul Drinkers, a very long time ago. We are renegades, yes, but we are not what you think. We have both been brought here by lies." "The oath we swore is no lie," Meccano replied. "And your corruption is as plain as could be, mutant." In the end, it was the raw power that Sarpedon possessed, the very quality that Meccano had dismissed as crude, that proved decisive. Sarpedon wrenched control of the psychic landscape one final time, pouring everything he had into the Nullwood shaft of his force staff. and the resulting blast of energy tore through Meccano's defenses. The chief librarian of the Howling Griffons fell. While the psychic duel raged, Captain Luco had fought his way to the chapter archive, the repository of the Soul Drinker's history, housed in a ship's chapel with mosaics on the floors and faded frescoes on the vaulted ceiling. Data stacks salvaged from the old Soul Drinker's fleet lined the walls, containing records that stretched back thousands of years. It was here that the Howling Griffons were heading, seeking proof of the Black Chalice's corruption, or perhaps simply seeking to destroy the Renegades' legacy entirely. There, amid the burning wreckage of a firefight that had left Soul Drinkers and Howling Griffons dead on the mosaic floor, Luco met Captain Darion of the Ninth Company. Darion was an assault captain, a formidable fighter with hundreds of kills marked in gemstones on his ornate armor and a glowing sword that had already claimed the lives of several Soul Drinkers. The two captains regarded each other across the corpse-strewn chapel, weapons raised, each waiting for the other to make the first move. It was Luco who spoke first. He showed Darion the archive, the real history of the Soul Drinkers, not the legend of the Black Chalice, but the truth, a chapter that had rebelled against corruption, that had been manipulated by forces from the warp, that had struggled to maintain its honor in a galaxy determined to destroy it. The records were there in the data stacks, dating back to before the schism. The Soul Drinkers were many things: renegades, mutants, outlaws, but they were not servants of the dark gods. A Howling Griffons tech marine scanned the archive's records, confirming that nothing in the Soul Drinkers' history matched the legend of the Black Chalice. The oath the Griffons had sworn was based on a phantom, a scar left on Vanqualis by someone from the old chapter, centuries or millennia ago, for reasons that none of them yet understood. "If this is over," said Darion, and there was a bitterness in his voice that came from a man realizing his brothers had died for a misunderstanding, "your guns fall silent too." "We won't shoot you in the back," said Luco. "We're not so far gone we don't honor a truce." "This is no truce. We will find you, renegade. We will bring you to justice." "You'll have to get in line," replied Luco. Then, with the particular gift he had for steering conversations toward what mattered most, "But there's still an oath that hasn't been fulfilled, Captain. Vanqualis. Last time I checked, the Greenskins were about to land on Heragrave and kill the people you swore to defend. I'd say that leaves you with a choice to make." "Vanqualis," said Darion, and the words seemed to bring him back from the edge of something dark. Darion spoke into his vox with the weight of a man making a decision that would define his chapter's future. "Howling Griffons, this is Captain Darion. Lord Meccano is lost. Fall back to the boarding units. Repeat, disengage and fall back, all units." Slowly, the gunfire from the Herald of Desolation began to fall quiet. Far below, on the shore of Heragrave, the final act of the war for Vanqualis was about to begin. The ramshackle fleet had crossed the sea from Nevermorn. Hundreds of vessels built from the jungle's trees, crammed with uncountable numbers of greenskins. Their chanting mixed with the crashing of waves into a relentless rhythm of bloodlust, like a song bellowed down from the orcish gods themselves. For a terrible age, perhaps an hour that felt like days, the defenders listened to the war chants getting louder and closer, and some of them went into fits of fear and madness as they realized for the first time the sheer scale of what was coming for them. Lord Sovelin Falcon was there. He had gone to the coast to earn back some measure of the honor he felt he had lost in failing to die at Palatium. He found himself in command of a ragged defensive line of household troops and civilian militia, men and women, who carried weapons their fathers had handed them with stern warnings that one day this shore would need defending. Some of them wore body armor that had been passed down through generations. Others had nothing but hunting rifles and the grim determination of people defending their homes and families. Sovelin had done everything he could. He set up his command post in a waste treatment plant, an ugly bastion of corroded rockcrete that still pumped industrial effluent into the sea, but which formed the anchor of the coastal line. He placed his most competent militia leaders on the flanks, and as they left for their posts they told him how their grandfathers had served under various falcons, and how it was an honor to take an order from the family once more. The words cut Sovelin deeply. These people trusted House Falcon. They believed in the old traditions. And Sovelin knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who has already seen the worst, that their trust might not be enough. The first ship, an enormous splintering hulk, rode up high on the crest of a wave and crashed onto the cruel rocks. Its hull broke apart, sodden wood tearing with the impact, and the ship disgorged 10,000 screaming greenskin slaves onto the shore. These were not real warriors. They were the disposable vanguard, the wretched slave creatures that the orcs herded before their armies to absorb bullets and set off mines. They died in their hundreds, their thousands, littering the shoreline with their twisted little bodies. But behind them came the true horde. Thousands upon thousands of orcs stormed ashore, blades high and guns spraying, baying and screaming with savage joy. Boats made of lashed timbers cut from Nevermourne's jungles crashed into the rocks, orcs leaping from their prows. Many vessels had sunk on the crossing, leaving countless greenskins to drown on the seafloor. But 3/4 of the horde had made it across, and that was more than enough. The warlord himself strode through the surf, the furnace within his mechanical body burning so hot that steam rose from his body in great billowing clouds. He had led these orcs from the war worlds of the Garan Nebula, welding dozens of feuding clans into a single fighting force through nothing but the sheer force of his will. No other orc possessed his vision, his discipline, his almost terrifying ability to think beyond the next battle. He understood things that his followers could not: strategy, patience, the value of waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was these qualities that had allowed him to time the invasion of Palatium to coincide with the trooping of the warding standard, catching the entire Vanqualian military exposed and vulnerable. It was these qualities that made him the most dangerous greenskin in the Obsidian system, and deep within him, something new blazed. Not just the familiar hatred and the gnawing lust for destruction, but something brighter: hope, joy, pride. At long, long last, victory was within his grasp. The cities of Heragrave stretched before him, their billions of inhabitants waiting to be conquered, and the fulfillment of everything he had fought for across the long years was finally tantalizingly close. The treatment plant fell in minutes. Explosions ripped through its walls, treatment tanks ruptured and spewed toxic steam, and orcs flooded into the breach like water through a crumbling dam. Sovelin tried to rally his men, tried to fall back and regroup, but the tide was too strong and too fast. He was carried aloft by the greenskins, his body torn apart by grasping claws even as he looked up at the sky and saw the red and gold gunships of the Howling Griffons swooping down to save a world they had briefly abandoned. The faintest spark of hope glimmered through the pain. Then he was dragged down into the darkness beneath dozens of greenskin bodies. A blade fell. His ribs collapsed, his skull fractured. Lord Sovelin Falcon died on the shore of Heragrave, and the hope he saw in the sky was not for him. Captain Darion led the assault personally. 300 Howling Griffons dropping from their Thunderhawks directly into the heart of the orc horde. They did not attempt a perimeter or a defensive line. They simply fell from the sky like lightning bolts. Bolt pistols blazing, chainswords raised to spear down into the mass of green flesh. Where they landed, shockwaves rippled through the orc army as greenskins were caught unawares, shot through the head or spitted on screeching blades. The Howling Griffon's livery of quartered red and gold blazed against the dull green of the orc horde like fire against shadow. At Darion's command, the surviving troopers of the 901st Penal Legion, the toughest, hardest-bitten killers who had somehow endured every battle from the Wraithspire Palace to the jungles to the boarding of the Brokenback, were deployed from a separate gunship directly on top of the orc warlord. They were the dregs of humanity, these men, murderers and thieves, heretics and cowards. But they had been forged by weeks of unrelenting war into something more, something fierce and unyielding, men who had discovered that they would rather die fighting than live in shame. The warlord fought like the primal force of destruction he was. He crushed men with his mechanical claw, shattering bodies as easily as a man might crush an insect. He grabbed a trooper by the head with his natural hand and squeezed until the skull collapsed. He flung the body so hard it knocked another man off his feet. These were not armored elites. They were ordinary humans, fragile and mortal, and against the warlord's immense strength and savage fury they should have lasted only seconds. But they clung to him. They jumped on his back, rammed bayonets into his joints, wrapped their arms around his legs, and refused to let go even as he flung them aside and trampled them. Lieutenant Kulek, the bear-like murderer with the shaven head, the man who had survived every battle on Vanqualis through nothing but sheer animal savagery, rammed a combat knife deep between the warlord's ribs and kicked the creature in the face hard enough to break bone. The warlord screamed, and more humans piled on, jumping on his back like hunters bringing down an enormous beast. The warlord tried to force his way back to his feet, tried to reach the armored human leader he could see atop a heap of greenskin dead. With a roar, he picked up Kulek with his claw and hurled him away. But he was still on his knees, slowed by a half-second that was just too long. Captain Darion activated his jump pack. The twin jets roared with flame, but Darion did not fly upward. He hurtled straight forward, toward the warlord, his glowing sword held out in front of him like the tip of a lance. The warlord tried to bring his claw down to snatch the armored human from the air, but the humans on his back held him back that crucial instant. Darion's sword punched clean through the warlord's mechanical torso, piercing the raging furnace that served as its heart. Raw flame spurted from the wound as the blade passed right through and out the creature's back. The warlord reared up, finally throwing the humans clear, but it was too late. The pressure inside was building beyond containment, the unbearable heat reaching a crescendo. The orc bellowed its rage one final time. And in a great searing ball of white flame, the warlord exploded. The blast knocked Darion off his feet and killed dozens of orcs in the immediate vicinity. When the light faded, all that remained of the most cunning and driven greenskin the Obsidian system had ever known was a smoking crater and a rain of burning debris. Without their leader, the orcs were lost. Their unity had been the warlord's creation, his vision, his will, his intelligence binding dozens of feuding clans into a single army. With him gone, that army began to fracture. The Howling Griffons pressed their attack, and the tide of green-skinned invaders was slowly, painfully pushed back toward the sea. Vanqualis would not fall that day. The war would continue for years, perhaps decades. The jungles of Nevermorn would never be truly cleansed of the greenskin taint. But the worst was over, and the people of Herograve could begin, at last, to hope. Aboard the Brokenback, Sarpedon was a prisoner. Eumenes had confined him to a cell and posted guards. The deal was done. Eumenes was chapter master now, and he wasted no time in addressing the assembled soul drinkers with his vision for the future. The Imperium would be destroyed. Its people, the ignorant masses who served as breeding grounds for chaos, would be burned away. The soul drinkers would be the instrument of that apocalypse. Those of you who have sworn to destroy chaos have also sworn to destroy the Imperium, Eumenes declared, his voice ringing with conviction, for it is among the ignorant masses of the Imperium that the seeds of chaos are sown. We shall burn it all, my battle brothers. The liars and the butchers, the ignorant and the corrupt, we shall burn them all. He never finished the sentence. Sarpedon had escaped. Not through strength or trickery, but through the psychic power of the hell, using it to incapacitate his guards and slip free while the chapter was assembled. Now he clung to the curved ceiling of the bridge, surrounded by captured banners and war trophies, his spider legs splayed out above the gathered soul drinkers, watching Eumenes with the faintest trace of amusement. "You are under arrest," said Eumenes, his voice cold with fury. "And now you have killed my battle brothers to escape. Your sentence is death." Sarpedon dropped from the ceiling with impossible grace, landing on his talons in front of Eumenes. "I sentenced you to death some time ago." "You gave your word." Eumenes roared, brandishing Mercano's force axe. "You relinquished command. We had a deal." "You betrayed us," said Sarpedon, and his voice was quiet now, steady and final. "You had Chaplain killed in front of my eyes. You betrayed every duty you ever had to this chapter. You betrayed your very emperor." He pointed a gauntleted finger at Eumenes. "You promised first." Eumenes looked around the auditorium, seeking support from his followers. Every soul drinker was on their feet, hands on weapons, the tension wound tight enough to shatter. If this conflict spread beyond the two leaders, it would consume the chapter entirely. Both sides knew it. "If you continue like this, Eumenes, this chapter will tear itself apart," said Sarpedon. You cannot mold Space Marines to your will. You can only lead them as best you can, and pray that they find in you a man worth following. That is what I have learned as your chapter master. End this now, and the chapter war will be over. But Eumenes would not yield. Sergeant Hecula tossed him the soul spear, that ancient weapon whose twin vortex blades were gateways to the warp itself. And with the axe in one hand and the soul spear in the other, Eumenes charged. The duel lasted a handful of seconds. The superhuman reactions of the watching soul drinkers meant they could perceive every movement, every nuance, and to them it seemed to unfold with terrible slowness. Sarpedon dropped onto his rear legs as Eumenes powered toward him. The twin blades arced past. The soul spear scored a furrow down his breastplate. The axe whistled under his chin. Eumenes was off balance, committed. Sarpedon shifted his weight, his rear legs driving him forward in a way only his mutations allowed. His front legs came up like the horns of a charging animal. The talons punched through Eumenes' abdominal armor, bone and chitin, and the cold blade of his bionic leg piercing through the ceramite. Sarpedon lifted Eumenes into the air, the younger space marine roaring with frustration as he tried to fight free. Sarpedon angled his legs downward and Eumenes slid off, crashing to the floor. Before he could raise the soul spear, Sarpedon was on him, all four front talons driving down into Eumenes' chest, slicing through lungs and hearts, through spine and into the deck beneath. Eumenes tried to speak. Only blood came. One arm flailed upward with the soul spear, but Sarpedon grabbed his wrist and forced the weapon from his hand. The spear's black blades retracted as it clattered to the floor, and by the time Sarpedon pulled his talons free, Eumenes was dead. Sarpedon stood over the body of his enemy, a man he had recruited, trained, and failed. "I have brought us here," he said, addressing the silent chapter. "I chose Eumenes, and granted him the armor of a full battle brother. I failed to see what he was planning, and I failed to stop the chapter war. In all these things I have failed you. If you will accept my command, I will be your chapter master again, not as a spoil won from Eumenes, but as a burden of duty as heavy as any I might place on you. If you can no longer trust me to lead you, step forward." The bridge was silent. Sarpedon cast his eyes over every face. Chaplain Ictinos behind his skull helm, Leuco with his barely contained fury, Sergeant Hecula who had served Eumenes faithfully, Apothecary Pallas whose betrayal had cut the deepest. None of them moved. "Then if you do not accept me," said Sarpedon at last, "you may leave the Brokenback, take a shuttle and go. The chapter war has claimed enough of us already." He turned to Leuco. "Captain, take the soul spear and lock it back in the armory. And to Ictinos' chaplain, bury my battle brother." Chaplain Ictinos held the funeral rites on the arena flight deck. The coffins of Eumenes and every soul drinker who had fallen in the Second Chapter War were jettisoned into space, spiraling away from the Brokenback into the cold void. Ictinos offered a prayer to Rogel Dawn and the Emperor to accept them into the ranks of humanity's honored dead. The entire chapter was in attendance, diminished now, perhaps 300 souls where once there had been many more. Sarpedon said nothing throughout the ceremony, saluting the coffins as they drifted away with the force axe that had belonged to Lord Mercano. Those who chose to leave, mostly scouts, including Hecula's squad, were allowed to go without hindrance. The chapter war was over. When the rites were done, Ictinos asked leave to pray and meditate on the events of the campaign. Sarpedon granted it. But Ictinos did not go to his cell, or to the seminary where he instructed his flock. Instead, he descended deep into the Brokenback, to the secret sanctum where the stone sarcophagus waited. Inside lay the bloated, blackened body of the astropath Koivas Velskanian, dead now, his life signs having flatlined while Ictinos was on the surface. He had served his purpose. Ictinos ignored the corpse. He turned instead to the books and scrolls he had brought back from the library orbiting Tarankos. Dozens of volumes, some of them ancient beyond reckoning, their crystal pages laden with meaning so profound that even Ictinos hesitated before opening them. And in the silence of his sanctum, the chaplain read. He read of the path along which the soul drinkers were destined to travel, and of the chapter's ultimate goal. The words had been written thousands of years ago by a hand that Ictinos revered above all others, a philosopher warrior of the old chapter whose name carried the weight of prophecy, Denyathos. the same ancient soul drinker whose quotations from the Catechisms Martial had preceded every chapter of the saga Ictinos had lived through, Denyathos, who had planned it all. The temple, the library, the legends of the Black Chalice planted on a dozen worlds, the manipulation of events stretching across millennia. Sarpedon did not know, of course. He was incidental to the true history of the soul drinkers. The chapter's rejection of the Imperium had been prophesied ages ago. Sarpedon was merely another actor in the great play, and his part had been written before he was born. Ictinos would have to bring the chapter to a place Denyathos had prepared, deep in the veiled region, a slice of the galaxy where astropathic messages arrived distorted or not at all. The isolation would be perfect. The next stage of the plan would proceed without interference. Convincing Sarpedon would be simple enough. The chapter master's principles and sense of duty made him predictable. Ictinos had needed little prompting to steer him toward the obsidian system. He foresaw no difficulty in manipulating him again. Ictinos put the book down. He had much to do. Prayers to lead, rifts to heal, brothers to counsel. Pallas in particular would need guidance before he felt part of the chapter once more. But all of it, every act of ministry and devotion, was in service of a vision so vast and so ancient that Ictinos himself was but a servant of a servant. The will of Denyathos would be done. There could be no doubt about that. And so the Brokenback turned its misshapen prow away from the obsidian system and powered into the void, leaving behind a world scarred by war but not yet broken. On Vanqualis, Countess Ismenissa received the news from her chamberlain with the composure of a woman who had weathered 2 centuries of crises. The Howling Griffons had returned to the fight. Captain Darion had taken command after the loss of Lord Mercano. The Orc warlord was dead, and without him the greenskin horde was fracturing. "Can we win?" the Countess asked. "Perhaps, my lady," said the chamberlain. It was the most hopeful word anyone had spoken on Vanqualis in weeks. When the Countess asked about the Black Chalice, the chamberlain was delicate. Captain Darion had not been entirely forthcoming. It seemed that the bearers of the Black Chalice had never truly been there, that there had been a great deal of confusion following the invasion. With Lord Sovelin dead, and Sovelin having been the one to raise the alarm, the chamberlain gently suggested that the matter might be laid at the young lord's feet, to satisfy the people and the lay parliament until the whole truth could be uncovered. The Countess looked carefully at her chamberlain. He was small and unassuming, but he had served her through many crises, and with the loss of so many peers at Palatium, she would need someone shrewd and dedicated at her side. She left such matters to him and turned her attention to leadership. The war would be long. The jungles of Nevermorn might never be truly cleansed of the greenskin taint. But the worst was over, and the people of Heragrave could begin, at last, to hope. She boarded her yacht and turned it toward the distant coast, stroking the head of one of her servitor children as the ramp closed behind her. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And aboard the Brokenback, the soul drinkers prayed and mourned and prepared themselves for whatever lay ahead. 300 warriors, renegade and mutated, hated by the Imperium they still served and manipulated by forces they did not yet understand. They had survived the Orcs, the Howling Griffons, and each other. They had lost friends and brothers, Carradine, the unbreakable captain in his Terminator armor, General Var, the condemned man who fought for redemption, the scout Rake, who betrayed the wrong chaplain, and Eumenes, the brilliant, furious young warrior whose vision of a galaxy burned clean had consumed him utterly. Perhaps 300 soul drinkers remained. Not long ago, they had numbered far more. The Second Chapter War had taken a toll that would be felt for years to come, and the rifts between those who had followed Eumenes and those who had stayed with Sarpedon would not heal easily. Apothecary Pallas walked the corridors of the Apothecarion in silence, tending to the wounded with hands that had betrayed everything he once believed in. Captain Luco sharpened his lightning claws and said little, carrying the weight of Carradine's death like a stone around his neck, and Sarpedon himself carried Mercano's force axe, a trophy or perhaps a reminder of the price of conviction, but they endured. In the silence of the void, in the heart of a ship that should not exist, the soul drinkers endured. And somewhere in the deep places of the Brokenback, in a half-flooded sanctum lit by glow globes that had burned for centuries, a chaplain read ancient texts by amber light. The words had been written by a philosopher warrior named Denyathos. a figure from the Soul Drinker's ancient past, whose quotations had guided the chapter through every trial, whose wisdom was inscribed in the Catechisms Martial that every Soul Drinker learned by heart. But Ictinos now knew something that no other Soul Drinker suspected. Deinyathos was more than a philosopher. He was an architect, a planner of such extraordinary vision that he had laid out the destiny of the Soul Drinkers thousands of years in advance. The rebellion against the Imperium, the mutations, the journey to the Obsidian system, all of it had been foreseen, planned for, set in motion by a mind that thought in millennia rather than years. Sarpedon believed he was free. He believed he had liberated the Soul Drinkers from the shackles of the corrupt Imperium and given them the independence to serve the Emperor on their own terms. He did not know that his every step had been choreographed by a dead man's hand. Ictinos turned the page and smiled and read on. The story of the Soul Drinkers was far from over. The veiled region awaited, that treacherous slice of the galaxy where astropathic messages went to die, where ships were lost and empires withered in isolation. Somewhere within it, Deinyathos had prepared a place for the chapter, a place where the next stage of the grand plan would unfold, a place where the Soul Drinkers would face truths about themselves that would shake them to their very foundations. But all of that lay ahead, in the darkness between the stars. For now there was only the silence of the void, the hum of ancient engines, and the quiet prayers of warriors who had survived the worst the galaxy could throw at them. And who knew, with the grim certainty that only a space marine could possess, that the worst was yet to come.